My name is Kim Kester, and as I said, Nora is a close colleague of mine. She is on faculty in the implementation science certificate course and co-teaches with my colleague Sarah Ackerman and I. And we didn't twist Nora's arm to do this talk this morning, but we knew that she was the one that had the most knowledge about the use of artificial intelligence in the context of qualitative data analysis. And so she has graciously agreed to come and talk with us about what's happening in that space. And there is a lot. So Nora is an assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at UCSF. She's trained as a social scientist and uses both qualitative and mixed methods within TB screening, diagnostics, and therapeutics research. Her research interests focus on understanding trajectories of mental health during TB diagnosis and treatment, and the influence of mental health on engagement with the TB diagnosis and care cascade. She also uses implementation science approaches for the integration of mental health services into TB care and treatment. And today, Nora is here to talk about the use of artificial intelligence in the context of qualitative data analysis. This session is going to be recorded, so I'm going to Mireia, thank you for starting that officially. And we will post this to our YouTube page in about a week from now, so you can share it with folks who were not able to come today. Nora, let me pass the baton to you. Thanks again.
First of all, thank you, Kim, for inviting me, and really appreciative of this opportunity to have this conversation with this group. I haven't met with this group before, but as Kim said, I do work largely in sort of tuberculosis, but I'm a social scientist by training and have been working in qualitative methods and mixed methods for the past decade plus. So I have been sort of, as I think many of us have, just thinking in this space of what is AI and how is it influencing our work. And so that's the purpose of this talk. I'm not an expert in AI. I have learned a lot about it in my sort of attempt to understand what's going on in the world of qualitative and AI, but I hope this will be a conversation as much as it is sort of me talking about my thoughts. So I'm starting out with acknowledgements because I think that that's useful, to just say, like, there are a lot of people who are involved in my thinking of this, including Alyssa Sales, who I believe is on this call, who's been working with me for the past couple of years, Sharon, who I believe is not on this call, Kim, Sarah, Andrew Kirchhoff, and then also the IS program qualitative data analysis faculty team, because we've just had a lot of sort of side conversations over the past year in particular about AI and qualitative research. So I want to start out with, I asked ChatGPT, what do you think I should title this talk? And I list the prompt below, above, and then below were the insights from ChatGPT. So I would say that we could all agree that potentially these are pretty positive thoughts from ChatGPT about how qualitative research might interact with AI. You know, here are some the top 5, I guess I would say, is, you know, how does qualitative how does AI enhance qualitative data interpretation? How do we harness artificial intelligence for data insights within qualitative research? So I think, you know, I thought this was useful, and I had, full disclosure, spoken to Kim and Sarah about this before, and we sort of were thinking about you know, the positive spin, I suppose, that you could say on the use of qualitative work and AI together. And so I think, you know, again, just presenting this as sort of an initial prompt for us to think about. But let's pull back the hood a little bit and think about like what is the sort of artificial intelligence and qualitative analysis, what's happening. So in terms of this is not meant to be like a didactic lesson on AI. That's not my area of expertise, but I think in terms of what's being used in terms in for qualitative analysis, it's useful to understand like how that's working. And so natural language processing, NLP, and large language models, LLM, are really what is being used to drive kind of qualitative analysis. And I'll get into it a little bit more in practical terms. But these are really driven by data. So like these are models that are driven that are fed by like text. So they're like taking information, they are learning, they're being taught by what is out there on the internet. So we've all, I think probably most of us have asked ChatGPT something at this point, right? We've all kind of gone in and said like, give me, you know, a reference for something, give me a citation for something, like tell me something that I need to know. And so it's only really as good as what you feed it, right? And these models are largely like learning from the internet. And so it's funny because someone recently told me, they were like, well, you could ask a large language model like ChatGPT to do a complex calculation. But if the internet, or if sort of the world of text has never done that calculation, they won't get the answer right. And so I think, you know, that's of interest to me, and I think will sort of carry forth into this talk a little bit more. And again, this is not an exhaustive list. There is more sort of generative. I think in the world of AI, there is a sort of separate world of kind of pushing forth models that are actually like more sort of human-like in terms of like generative and thought, and that's not what we're seeing here in qualitative research. We're really sort of situated in these natural language processing and large language models, which draw from sort of data and text. But again, there are more advanced models that are, I think, being used in the world. So again, how is qualitative software using AI and generative AI? So we've seen, I think probably folks who are on this call have seen like Atlas TI, there are features saying like, oh, do you want AI to do this for you? Do you want AI to do that for you? And so Atlas TI, Max QDA, and Vivo, many of the platforms that most of us are familiar with are integrating and have integrated, even with sort of you got an upgrade and now you're now you're seeing that there are AI features in your software. And so this is largely using the large language model and sort of natural language processing. This is not generative AI. This is not necessarily like the higher level kind of AI that we're thinking about. This is sort of drawing upon text to create things, which, you know, makes sense, I think, from a basic standpoint for qualitative research. And then we're also seeing like these institutionally approved platforms like UCS. I'm going to use UCS Versa as an example, but I know many of you are from other institutions, and you probably see at your own institutions that there are platforms that are using like OpenAI technology. And so these features, specifically like talking to the qualitative platforms, have things like automated coding, data summaries, like I will summarize this transcript for you. Here's a theme, here's like how you can chat with AI, and you can feed information. Feed is maybe not the best word, but you can give information to a into this AI platform, and you can say like, I'm interested in XYZ. Can you sort of tell me about that from my data? And so this is very much now built into a lot of these classic sort of qualitative platforms, which we think of, I would say historically, I've always thought of as data organization platforms as opposed to sort of data analysis platforms. And I think that's how many of us were trained, is that it's not like Stata. It's not like you're plugging sort of code in. You're very much in charge. They're much more for organization than they are for analysis. And now there are these features that are very analytical or presented as analytical. And so I just want to take a little bit of time to show those of you who haven't seen like Atlas TI and AI. So Atlas TI, which is a platform that I work with quite a lot, and I think many of us do, has this, qualitative coding platform, and now there is AI coding, where and this is the text directly from Atlas TI. The quote, that AI coding automatically analyzes text, breaks it down into paragraphs, creates quotations, uses AI models to apply inductive codes to every quotation. And, features like coding, suggested codes, chatbot, and summaries. And so these are tools that I think for many of us, all of a sudden just became available in our Atlas platforms or in our Max QDA or whatever sort of platform you use. And I think, like a number of folks on this call, I sort of said, well, okay, where is this coming from? What does this mean? And I think, back to my point about what large language models do, and they are drawing upon information, they're drawing upon text, but not necessarily human based. And so here again, and I give credit to Alyssa Salis for these slides. Like, this is an example of AI sort of taking text and giving codes and summarizing. We've looked at summaries of suggested codes. We've compared it to our own summaries. AI will do all of this for you within a lot of the platforms that many of us work to organize our data as opposed to analyze our data. But now there's sort of this analytic component that's available to us. So where are we now? I've talked to a lot of folks over the past sort of year, and I think we span a lot of spaces, right? Like, there are folks who I think feel like this is not, this is truly removing the human from the qualitative process, which is critical. And then there are people who are sort of in the middle, who feel like, we need qualitative work is so extensive. Qualitative research takes so much time. Like, how can we, get more support? Does AI provide that? And then I think there are also people who are like, oh, there are these tools that are just telling me how to do it within this software. So I can just use that to go forth. And that's a qualitative analysis. And so, there's this, like everything, there's a spectrum. And I would say that I tend to fall at the more conservative end of the spectrum as a qualitative researcher, and have had many conversations with other, like, classically trained qualitative researchers. I would say I fall like on the upper side of this set of quotations, and it makes me a little bit sick to my stomach. But I'm also trying to understand that, we have these tools available, and we need to understand that there is a tremendous appetite for qualitative research now, and there is a tremendous amount of it happening, as I think many of us know, in our own sort of work, but also in the work that we see. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So, yeah, I it's really about like we have such a varied response around this. So I think some of this is we've seen, I mean, this community probably understands this better than any. Um, in the past 10 years, there's just been an explosion of like writing qualitative research into grants and methods and including that as an approach. And I think that's great. And I'm not unsupportive of that. But I think that what we're seeing now is that with that, we see like an interest in using sort of, I don't even want to call it shortcuts, but I think like uh, different approaches and ways to address sort of how to deal with qualitative data among folks who aren't necessarily like trained in qualitative data analysis. And so I think again, like I thanks to Sarah and Kim, like I work on the implementation science qualitative course, and we tremendous amount of folks who have Ks and sort of are not like a lot of early stage investigators who are doing qualitative research but don't necessarily have the training that many of us do. And so there's you know a desire to say like how do we cut not how do we cut corners, but how do we get this done in an efficient way? And I think also within like the implementation science field, there's been a push to sort of say like, okay, we take, you know, we have implementation science methods. We're trying to sort of rapidly understand how to implement something, and how do we, you know, use qualitative methods, but also like use them rapidly. And so I think again, this is where this intersects with AI pretty significantly, as well as you know within masters and doctoral students. I think there's really been a push to I know that like certified programs now have a qualitative component, and it's, as far as I understand it, it's pretty minimal, but but you know there's again like a recognition of qualitative in the field, and I think that that's in the field of public health, and I think that's great, in medicine, and I think that's great. But I think there that comes with sort of a how do we do this in a rapid way, um, and some of that comes with the question of you know what does that look like, and how do we sort of protect, and these are some of the best conversations I've had in the past couple of years, is how do we protect these tenets of qualitative research and inquiry, because they're not they are human driven, and they are very much about the person and the analyst and the researcher, and we spend a lot of time like thinking and unpacking that in our work, and so where does AI fit into that is a big question. And so, like, to this point, does AI uphold the principles of qualitative research and analysis? Like, does it stick with rigor as we understand it? I mean, is there if you're asking AI to do, like I showed in the previous slides, if you're asking AI to do your coding, what's the dependability? What's the audit trail? What was AI reflexive in the same way that I might write a reflexive memo about how, you know, I sort of brought my own perspective into a specific topic, how I, you know, did my own kind of introspection. You can't ask a large language model to do that same thing. I mean, I suppose you could, but I'm not sure what you would get from it. Um, and in my mind, at least in qualitative research, like I spend a lot of time thinking about my audit trail, and like if someone went back, like could they replicate the work that I did? Not precisely, probably, because I am my own person, and we all understand like that we bring bias as qualitative researchers into the work that we do. But with AI, you really truly are losing that potential level of um, reflexivity and audit trail and confirmability and credibility. And so I think when we, you know, I think many of us probably have felt over the past decade that there's a bit of an attack on, like, not an attack, but just an inquiry on, like, what is rigor in qualitative research, and what are we doing, and how are we sort of supporting the process that we go through. Um, and I think that AI truly, and large language models, like, cannot hold that up even more than we have. And I think that we have, as a community, done a really good job in, both kind of trying to balance this, like, human and, I guess I'm struggling for the right way to say it, but the sort of, the tenets of qualitative research and the importance of, the human role in the analytic process. And I think that AI sort of does, like, take that out of this process. And I think that most of us who are qualitative researchers would agree that you have to be there, you have to familiarize yourself with your data. And so if you are, relying, for example, on AI to summarize your data, and you're skipping that step of reading through your transcripts, what does that mean? Like, how close are you going to get to your data? Because that's a lot of what we talk about, is closeness to our data and engagement with our data. Um, and I just wanted to add this part about, like, what happens when AI hallucinates in analysis. And I think hallucinate is a difficult term, and I've talked to some folks in sort of the AI space about that. I mean, it is their term. I did not make this term up. But what happens with, and this is, again, as I understand it, is what happens is that when there is text or information that, like, large language models don't sort of have a place to put, for example, they then will sort of default to, like, drawing from what they know, essentially. Um, so there was an example from a paper where that I'm happy to provide a citation for, where they were sort of like, okay, they were asked for a theme, essentially, like the large language model was asked for a theme and couldn't come up with a quote for the theme. And so instead of, like, saying there is no quote, it made up a quote from the data that didn't exist. And so, I think that should be a pretty big red flag for all of us, who do analysis, that, what happens? We pride ourselves, obviously, um, on our rigor and on our methods, and so if we're relying on something that actually, like, makes up data that doesn't exist, I think that's just, to me, that was a huge red flag in terms of using AI to do data analysis. And I'm not saying that's the only thing that happens when AI hallucinates. I think there are a lot of other things that happen, and not all of them are necessarily, like, detriments, but that's certainly a concern, to me, and a big red flag in terms of, using artificial intelligence to do qualitative analysis. And I think that gets to the last point on this slide about fidelity to data content. I mean, again, we spend a lot of time with our data. We spend a lot of time getting to know our data. And so, like, do we trust artificial intelligence to do the same? It seems like potentially not, in my opinion. And so then there's also just a number of questions around, like, data and participant privacy. So we consent participants, or at least I will say I consent participants, in the studies that I work on. And I say, here are the things that, like, your data will be used for, here are the ways they'll be used, here's who's going to have access to that. And with AI, if you're plugging something into um, an AI based platform, like, are you actually using participant data in the way that they consented it to be used? And to me, that's a big question mark. And I think one that hasn't been really addressed necessarily. Similarly with data ownership, like if you're putting things into, and again, on the left there, or on the right, I suppose, on your screen, there are some really good papers that have been recently published around like the ethics of using AI in qualitative research, and bring up a lot of these topics. And also authorship and peer review. I mean, I think in particular, peer review is one that I have thought quite a lot about and would be curious to discuss with this group. What do you want to see? Like, I would expect to know if somebody used AI in their analysis, but also I would expect that I would want to know if somebody used AI in a peer review situation, which I think is happening more and more, where folks are plugging in like papers and asking for peer review, like reports from qualitative data that's being presented. And so again, like there's a whole world of questions and not a lot of guidelines around this. Again, I'm sorry, this is probably more questions than answers in this talk, but that was what I said to Kim when I agreed to give it, was that it was going to be a lot of questions, and hopefully a discussion. And so again, we can just see this like proliferation of AI and qualitative analysis. I mean, there's been a lot of questions. There have been some really great papers, and some of them are on the right, around comparing like human to AI or chat GPT, large language model. I'm trying not to just say AI, because I think there are nuances within that. But around analysis in qualitative, and we've seen just this jump in the amount of work that's being done, and also these really great papers that are comparing, okay, fine, like let's take a human, let's take a person, and let's take chat GPT or whatever mechanism you're using. It could be Atlas or Max QDA. They use the same underlying AI mechanisms, and let's compare them. And the comparisons are interesting. I think that was the first thing that I thought when this sort of started to become popular or a thing, was to say like, okay, like how does it compare? And I think there are some comparisons that are useful, right? And so I think we also need to think about like what are the ways that we could use AI in our work. Because I will say, I was at a conference a couple weeks ago, and I was giving a talk about multi-country qualitative analysis and the complications of it and how much work it takes, and folks were saying, they were like, well, what are the ways that we can use AI to help us? And so I spent some time thinking about that, and I think it's useful to think about that. And so I think, it depends, right? What is the intention? Like, and I've talked to folks on both the sort of like AI development side, and I've talked to folks on the qualitative side, and I've talked to folks who are sort of on the implementation science side, everyone kind of in between. And I think it depends. So it depends on the intention, right? Like what are you trying to get out of your data? If you want to really just use qualitative data to summarize something in a very sort of surface level way, which I think is not the intention of qualitative data collection and qualitative data analysis, then sure, I do think you could use qualitative AI based sort of Atlas TI situations to do that. But, you know, would I, if I read a paper that did that and said that, would I call that like a qualitative analysis? Probably not. Um, but could you do that? Absolutely. I mean, those tools are now there. And I think that that's part of what inspired this talk, is to say the tools are there, right? Like they're embedded into, all of our qualitative analysis softwares. They're there. So people will use them, and they will be used in that way. And so what is the sort of like next step in terms of both how do we synthesize, how do we how do we address that as a community? I think as a qualitative research community, how do we consider, if we're presented with a paper where someone says that, they used AI for qualitative data analysis, which honestly at this point isn't even like a checkbox in most sort of publishing guidelines. So I think maybe even to sort of take it back a step, that Kim and Sarah and I and others have talked about is what do we sort of put up as metrics around sort of intention and use for qualitative data within sort of the metrics of AI. Like, if we see a paper that comes across our desk and it says like, okay, we used AI to summarize our data, and then we did coding based on like AI suggested codes, like what would we do with that? Like, how would we think about that? I don't have an answer for that. I just think this is coming for all of us. We're probably going to need to think about it. So I think a lot of the questions here are, how can we use AI? Because I understand there is an appetite for qualitative work, and I think we all know there's a push to do more qualitative, and I think that's good. And but is using AI to do qualitative research, is that useful? Is it, and what can it be done with? And so again, I think, it depends on the intent. Like, I could see, for example, as someone who works in implementation science, this is not how I operate, but someone saying like, okay, I have a framework that I want to sort of plug my data into. And again, with the technology that we have with these large language models, they will pull various words. And so you can say like, okay, I want barriers and facilitators, for example, and I want to fit them within this framework. And so you could see like asking AI that, and again, like the more you train kind of your model, even if you're working within Atlas TI, you can say like, you can give it information and say what you're looking for, and the more information you give it, the more likely it is to sort of pull out the things that you might be interested in, and say like, okay, I'm interested in these barriers and these facilitators, and these are kind of the terms that fit within these barriers and facilitators. And then, sure, it could pick out barriers and facilitators potentially from your data. So if that's sort of the intention, maybe that works. If you want to just summarize your data, sure, maybe that works. But does that actually do justice to what's in your data and, what you're taking out of it? I would say no, but I'm happy to be disagreed with. And so I guess to sort of summarize, where are we going? I think there's a lot of conversation happening about the appropriateness of AI in research settings. Disclosure of data use, I touched on that a little bit, but we haven't even I think it's starting to happen, but begun to touch upon like consent forms, how we consent participants to use their data in AI platforms, and community engagement. I mean, we haven't, in my opinion, like talked to the folks that we work with, beyond the research community about the use of AI. And that's a huge gap. And to me, like, we should not be using AI for with people's data before talking to the people that we work with and the communities that we work with. And again, I would be happy to be, um, you know, disagreed with if that's happening, but I have not seen it in my own work. Um, and then I think just this ongoing interrogation of AI versus human generated results in different settings, languages, and topics is really important. Particularly languages. I think that because a lot of the AI within qualitative analysis programs is large language model focused or normal language model focused, um, it's not attuned to languages that are not sort of commonly out there in the internet, on the world, in the world. But many of us engage and speak in languages beyond English, and so there's just a really big lack of that, and that influences like the type of results that you get when you engage with large language models in the qualitative data management programs that we all use. And then engage guidelines. I mean, this is something that we've all talked about. I think the EU has actually, the European Union has developed some sort of living guidelines around the use of AI in research, but I have not seen similar things in the US. And some of us have talked about how we haven't seen similar things at all, or nothing at all within qualitative research. And so that's another sort of critical area where I think we're going, and where we need to think. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to stop blabbering and give some space for discussion, because I know it's a lot.
Hi.
Thank you so much, Nora. Boy, there is a lot to dive into, and I want to open it to the community. Do you want to take your slides down, and maybe people, if they're interested in coming off camera? I mean, yeah, camera. And
Hi, Nora. This is Carmen Masson. Nice
Hi,
to meet you.
Carmen.
Hi, thank you for such a great talk. What occurred to me, and how I might see the use of AI being valuable is for like validity checks. Let's say you're like you talked about doing international work and you do qualitative work and it's in different languages and there are regional differences in language and you're trying to make sense of the meaning, right, of the text. I can imagine that you could use AI to kind of validate what a translator has done with regard to their interpretation of what the person said. I could see it valuable in that way.
Well, I think the challenge there, I agree with your point. I think the challenge there is AI is, specifically large language models, are only as good as what information they have. And so like with different languages, so I spent a lot of time like working in Uganda with the Luganda language. It's just that large language models don't have a lot of data on Luganda, so they can't, like, it's not a good check in that there's just not enough information there. So I think that is one of the challenges potentially. But I agree that in sort of more like widely used languages like Spanish, French, like something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, English. That could work.
Yeah. Yeah, I could definitely see it in Spanish, for example, my native language. But I think over time, as you say, there will be a larger database, right?
Yeah, and there is, I mean, anecdotally, I had a colleague from Uganda who said that they're getting like WhatsApp messages asking them to record like 5-minute clips of them talking and then send it in for like, you know, the equivalent of 50 cents basically. And that's all to feed these models. And yeah, so it is happening.
Nora, thanks. Oh, did someone
Sarah,
else
then
have their hand
Ashley.
up?
No, you go, Sarah, then Ashley will go.
Okay, thanks. Nora, thanks for that great talk. I would love to hear your and others' thoughts about what AI use means for this idea that, well, this dichotomy that floats around a lot in qualitative research and health of inductive versus deductive analysis, which I think is kind of a surrogate for descriptive versus interpretive. So I literally was just sent a paper yesterday by some researchers claiming that AI does just as good a job with inductive analysis as humans. This just raises all kinds of questions for me about what do we actually mean by inductive. So I'm just putting that question out.
I'm happy to start, but I would be also very happy for others to join in. I mean, I don't think that it can do as good of a job with inductive. I guess I think that we've seen from some of the comparative papers, which again, I'm happy to share with this group further and will attach in my slides, that there are just a lot of things that are missed regardless. And you know, I think Kim, Sarah, and I have talked about, like, you can't take the person out of the qualitative in many ways, and in trying to do that, you lose quite a lot from your data. But I'd be curious what others think about that.
Julia?
Oh, I thought there was somebody right after me or before me.
Well, do you want to comment on this particular point about
I'm sorry, my point's related, or my question's related, but not specifically this.
I would just say that I think that AI probably does a very good job with a descriptive analysis. And so we'll give Versa that. Can it hallucinate descriptions in some ways? I'm imagining it sure can, but inductive, I would love to debate someone who would suggest that AI could do an equivalent job with an inductive analysis. It cannot, because not everything is spoken. And if we are relying on AI to take apart words, when we know there is much more than words in the stories, then it just seems like it's self-evident that AI couldn't do as good a job, in my opinion.
I think, like, relatedly, I know nothing about this, Nora, so I'm so happy for this presentation. And it's bringing up, like you said, like, just all questions, right? Related to this conversation, I'm thinking about kind of like how my mind goes into analyzing data, and I personally find theoretical frameworks to be very enriching for me when I'm approaching data. So I'm curious, like, does AI develop its own theoretical framework based on like all the knowledge out in the universe and then apply, or is it like strictly looking for patterns? I'm not sure how to think about what AI is doing.
It looks for patterns. So like if you ask, and again, if you ask it, so like there's a paper that I'll link to, if you sort of say like, okay, take this implementation science framework and plug the data into it, like it can kind of do that if there's enough information about that framework out there. And because again, it's like it's drawing on information that exists. And it is very pattern based. So again, it's I think, yeah, as Kim is noting in the chat, like a Marxist lens to analyze data, it can do that, because there's like data around like what is a Marxist lens, like, but it also it gets things very wrong, because particularly with qualitative, I found like there is a lot of misinformation about like what is like grounded theory, what is what is content analysis? Like I mean, I think PhD students struggle with that question. So it will similarly like not apply appropriately sort of those pieces of information unless it's very like able to like distill it from the internet, or not the internet, I suppose, but like from the existing data. Whereas why I think in quantitative analysis, and I've talked to a lot of quantitative folks, it is more useful because it can like, there is like an ability to say like, okay, here's code. Like I'm going to write like a code to do like a power calculation or something like that, like a sample size calculation. And I've honestly used it for that, to be like, okay, like here's like my population, here's this, here's that. Like I want like a sample size that is appropriate for this study. And then I've been able to go and like be like, and now send me this data code, and it'll send you data code and you can go like cross check it. But that's very, very different than qualitative research, as we know.
Right. But like the functionality within like Atlas TI, for example, I've never looked at it, but that's just patterns, strictly patterns, not informed by any. Okay. Thank you. Sorry to take so long with that.
No, sorry. And I went on a tangent.
Yeah.
It's a good question.
Ashley.
Hi, thanks so much for that talk. Yeah, this is also more kind of question and thinking it through. Going back to the issue of like, the human-centered aspect of qualitative work. And I was thinking a lot about, the relationship between like the researcher and data generation, and then what's happening in your analysis afterward. Like, I do field work, but I do more quantitative, but I'm usually so involved in the data generation. Like when you were talking about like, how does someone work on their data without really understanding it? Like I think about that even in like a spreadsheet, not just, in a transcript, right? And so I'm thinking like, do you think that there's a big difference in terms of the like the quality that can come out of like an AI analysis, depending on how involved, the analyst is in the data generation process? Like if you're doing all the interviews on your own and then you use AI, so you're really deep in the data already, that would be different than if you have a team of people doing it versus if you were scraping data from some other source, right? You get more and more removed from the data. And I'm wondering, like what you think about that dynamic.
It's a great point. I think that, and I think this is one that people use who work closely with sort of ChatGPT or AI or whatever module they're using, is that yes, the more you put into it, I think the more you can potentially get out of it. Like the more information you feed to it, and the more you train it, as I understand it, the more you can do. Again, I don't think you can, but to me, like if you're going to put that much work into training something, why aren't you just doing it yourself? But that's me as a qualitative researcher, I suppose. But yes, I do think there's, there is probably some way to kind of like train our models more. But again, I think it depends on what you want to get out of it. I don't think that you can, to me, as a qualitative researcher, like reading through every transcript and thinking about every sort of aspect of that transcript and then summarizing it in my own memos, like you can't replace that. And I don't think that Chat GPT or AI can replace that, at least not now, at least not large language model based, because it's really just, which is what we're talking about, because it's really just pulling like pieces of text, summarizing words. It's not actually doing sort of the synthesis part that we as humans with human brains do. I don't know if that answers your question, but
No,
also welcome others to chime in.
Absolutely. Yeah. But I feel like it also just kind of, the problem gets more and more severe, the less interaction you've had with the data from the outset, right? And so it just becomes like a deeper problem.
I think
Yeah.
a really
Go ahead,
good, I think Ashley raises a really good point that follows on what you mentioned, which is the cornerstone of qualitative data analysis, which is closeness to the data. And I feel like this is a good discussion to have in a future session where we talk about the value of AI in the context of being very familiar with your data, because I do think that's where we might be able to try to lean in. And the opposite is true, of course, is, the perils of letting AI analyze data that you just don't have any familiarity with. I want to move us along to Shannon and then Carol.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. So I am thinking of this both in a couple of contexts. One, I teach qualitative methods to graduate students, including MPH students that will go out into practice. And so thinking about the use of AI, like I've got a student now who we did a lot of work together, and now he's in a position where they're using like AI, not in the cloud, but like their company has their own secure software and they use it for analysis, and it's just the reality of the world. And so I love this conversation because it's really, when I think about teaching, it's like not about endorsing or not endorsing, but about helping them think critically about new tools. And so like, Nora, I love that you're tying it back to like, okay, what are the core values? What are the principles here that we're looking for? And like, how does this new tool fit in? And really like that practice, I think, is essential. And I had to engage with a student last week who produced something and said like, oh, I used ChatGPT for this. And I was like, oh, why don't we work together to come up with some guidelines for the team? Like here are my considerations. And so I think, anyway, so just coming at this also from working with a bunch of young people that are really hungry for these tools, and a bunch of different contexts. So it seems to me that places where it could potentially work are like quality improvement studies, things that are, and like, especially in a practice setting, like maybe it does, if the quality is good enough, expand opportunities for integrating qualitative data into like public health practice in a way that was just not possible because they didn't have the person power to do analysis. And so maybe there are ways to apply it. And again, like you were saying with like barriers, like are there very straightforward things that people are trying to get from qualitative data that can be then leveraged in practice really quickly? But I'm curious about folks' thoughts on like contrasting cases. Okay, so you produced some themes and we can check those. But can we get AI to like look and say, okay, what did we miss? Or like, here's our thematic analysis. What did we miss? Can you assess whether like we are representing things sort of similarly to the patterns they see? And then also, is there anything that we're missing? Or alternatively, if we're asking ChatGPT first or an AI first for themes, is it going to ever consider the one person whose story like busts open our understanding of an issue? Or does it just ignore it because it's just counting?
Yeah, I think because of, to your sort of former point, I think because of the way that large language models work, it doesn't have the ability to sort of do that nuanced, like this is a divergent case, or this is like a sort of the way that we would consider it as humans in a qualitative process, which I think again gets back to why it's hard to remove the human from the qualitative process. But I do, I mean, again, yeah, I do agree. I think there's such an appetite to like delve into qualitative research and understand like where we can use these as tools that might help. But yeah, I think my ultimate feeling is that, well, like it's here to stay, and we have to all address and understand how to use AI in our work, whether we want to use it or not, and guide students, as you were saying, which is, I think, also going to be very important.
And I think to Tor's point,
please.
can we figure out how to use these tools so that we can focus on the fun part? Like we should be using these tools to automate the boring stuff. So we still get to play.
And I think that's some of the interest is like, again, when I was at this conference, we were talking about this in this workshop, and folks were like, well, we all love qualitative and we love doing it, but it takes so much time and we're so busy. Like, and we believe in it, but how do we kind of like, where can we like use this to kind of make our lives a little bit easier?
Can I go to our
Yeah.
faculty meetings? Carol?
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm also a person that's trying to stay really open-minded and was really interested in this talk. I'm sorry I had to join it late because of a prior thing, but I actually, found that a lot of my kind of feelings are being confirmed by Nora and others here. But there's one point that I don't know that has been fully brought up yet, which does kind of tie back to some of the things you were saying, Nora, about work in Uganda. But I think I'm thinking a lot about, like, for those of us who are working in multi-regional teams, and we're trying to do so in a way that is anti-colonialist, anti-racist, and that is inclusive of local cultural expertise and the posing of questions and then the interpretation of data and the production of scientific knowledge. Like, where does that cultural expertise reside? And how will AI kind of reproduce or entrench, disparities, global disparities, power disparities? Does it have, like, are there potentials to actually decrease disparities? But what would that look like? I mean, I think, like you were saying, there's not like, large language models don't have like, Runyonkole and Luganda and Kiswahili and Luo, and they don't have those languages feeding them, but they also don't have the cultural understandings. And I'm thinking, what would AI not get? How much does language include? How much does the text include? How much cultural meaning is emotional and relational? Like, we can read a text and we can know the kind of emotional impact of a certain finding in a particular cultural setting. And especially the people who are from that cultural setting understand this particular finding has real power. Like in the study where we had like the community health fairs, and you see the guys from participant observation, the guys are like standing at the edge of the post-test station, like judging who's HIV positive and who's HIV negative based on how long they're sitting in the post-test area, so they can know who to date, So like, and we know like what it would mean socially for someone, who's that adolescent girl who's in the post-test area, who's like has a bunch of guys assuming she's HIV positive. We understand all the implications of what that means for her. So we know that particular finding from that particular field note is really, really important. And, what does AI do with these kinds of cultural understandings? And I guess I get concerned about, okay, well, maybe AI gives access and power to people who have fewer educational opportunities. But I'm worried that it would also kind of obscure local cultural expertise and not facilitate it, not facilitate inclusion. So I feel like there has to be a really strong voice in our community of ethics and the ethics of research. We have to bring that into our critique, I think. At the same time, I really like, I've had my ears open for, something encouraging that would help me feel like, no, actually, AI can help us have insights, can help us with the surprises that we're always looking for when we're using an inductive approach. It's not only about kind of drawing on theory. I get that I could say, like, analyze this using a Marxist framework, and it could do that. But the point is, with inductive, we are there in our interactive relationship, in this interpersonal relationship with our data, as Kathy Sharma says, we're getting into an interactive space. And we're bringing all of our expertise and knowledge, and the more the better in terms of theory and different disciplinary influences. And, can it do that? And can it lead us to new insights? I want to try to stay open-minded, but I also feel like if we can keep an ethical lens very, very clear, not only around rigor, but also around inclusion and equity, it will help kind of preserve the human.
Yeah, I think part of what I struggled with in honestly developing this talk was trying to stay sort of balanced when I felt sort of very much as you do, Carol, around kind of major concerns around the ethics and the cross-cultural sort of applicability of using AI. So yeah, I'm with you, and I think Kim and Sarah and I have talked a little bit about how do we move forward and what do guidelines look like, and how do we sort of develop these as a community of practice and research. Yeah, I'll stop there.
This is so excellent. Thank you, Nora.
Yes, and yeah, so let me just say thank you, Nora, and anyone who needs to leave for another talk. Thanks for being here. Thanks for all the great comments. Daryl is just mentioning that we should check out Perplexity AI, which cites its output with links that we can manually check. Yeah, Carol, thank you for such an eloquent observation about where we need to place our emphasis, which is in this space of inclusivity and equity, and keeping an eye on the growing disparities that I've not spent a lot of time thinking about that. So I really appreciate you raising it. And I also, just before anyone leaves, if anyone in this group has a good case study that you would like to present to us, so that we can learn from you about the ways in which AI has facilitated your work, please do get in touch. I think it was really helpful to hear Shannon, who I don't think is here anymore, but Shannon Watkins talk about how she's approaching the topic with her students. And, you know, she's working in a very particular kind of place and location. And so I think because of that place and location and her student body, reminding all of us that AI might be a tool and a technique that does afford access into qualitative research when that had been previously, you know, unimaginable. So I feel like there are going to be ways in which you know, inclusivity can be enhanced, but we need to hear these stories. We can't just theorize about them. And so come and talk with us about both cases where things have gone awry, but where you have found it has been useful. Thanks to everyone for being here.